early November, I was 44 and working as a regional insurance compliance auditor, moving through northern Arizona to review small commercial policies before renewal season. I usually avoided hotels on these trips. Quiet mattered more to me than amenities, especially when I had hours of file review to finish after dark. This stop required 2 evenings of paperwork before I could drive out to several rural properties beyond Flagstaff, so I booked a detached Airbnb guesthouse behind a larger suburban home. The listing emphasized privacy and self-check-in convenience, which suited me. Cold desert air drifted through the cracked window with the faint, dry smell of juniper. If you subscribe, you'll hear more accounts like this told as plainly as they happened. My plan was uncomplicated. I would spend the evenings reviewing claim files, then use daylight for site visits and photographs. The host never contacted me directly, only through automated Airbnb messages that included the keypad code and standard check-in reminders. The main house looked occupied but quiet, with a porch light that stayed on steadily from dusk onward. Inside the guest house, everything had the neutral, recently reset feel of a space meant for constant turnover. A small table, a wall heater, basic cookware, no personal items. On the kitchen counter, a laminated checkout card listed the usual departure steps and an 11 a.m. checkout time. The first night, sometime after midnight, I heard a light crunch of gravel outside the small side window. It was the kind of sound that suggested one careful step rather than someone walking normally. I assumed it was the homeowner moving between the house and backyard. When I looked up, the driveway appeared empty. At that same moment, the porch light on the main house went dark for a second or two, then returned. I remember noticing the microwave clock reading 12:43 a.m. before I went back to work. It seemed easy enough to explain, and I did not think about it much after that. The next night, almost at the same time, I heard the gravel again while I was reviewing inspection notes at the table. I stopped typing and waited. Nothing passed the window, and there was no knock, no car door, no voice. A few seconds later, the porch light on the main house switched off, held there briefly, then came back on. By the following morning, I noticed the guesthouse curtains had shifted slightly apart, even though I was certain I had closed them fully before bed. I corrected them and left for work. On the third night, the sequence repeated with a precision that was harder to dismiss. Faint movement on gravel, the porch light going off, then back on, as though someone wanted a clearer look at whether the guesthouse was still lit from inside. By then I had begun paying closer attention to timing. The sounds came when my desk lamp was still on, and my laptop was open, not later, not earlier. I started to wonder whether someone in the main house was simply checking whether guests were awake or asleep. That thought was not dramatic, but it was difficult to make harmless. The dark window behind my screen had started to feel reflective, almost watchful, and I found myself working with the exterior light off. If you appreciate slow burn, realistic horror, leave a like. I told myself repetition alone was not evidence of anything beyond curiosity. On the fourth night, I decided to turn off every light in the guesthouse earlier than usual and sit quietly in the dark for a few minutes before going to bed. The wall heater hummed, then clicked off, and the room settled into that hollow kind of silence where small noises carry farther than they should. The gravel sound came again, but this time it did not remain near the window. It moved closer and stopped directly outside the door. There was no knock. No voice. At almost the same instant, the porch light on the main house switched off and the narrow driveway disappeared into darkness. Then I heard the keypad. Not a full code, just a few soft electronic beeps, spaced apart, as if someone were testing the buttons without intending to enter. I stayed completely still. After several seconds, the pressure of a presence outside the door lifted. The porch light came back on. I waited nearly 10 minutes before crossing the room. When I looked through the side window, the driveway was empty again, but the keypad numbers still held a faint glow from recent use. I slid a chair beneath the door handle, not because I believed it would stop anyone determined, but because it gave me something practical to do. The lock itself appeared secure. After a minute, I opened Airbnb and sent the host a short message asking whether anyone had come by to check the property. The reply arrived 20 minutes later at 1:18 a.m., saying no one had been outside and that it was probably a neighbor walking nearby. That explanation was possible in the abstract, but not in the shape the night had actually taken. The heater cycled off again, and the silence afterward felt larger than the room. I did not sleep much. In daylight, the gravel driveway made things less ambiguous without making them clearer. The surface recorded a single set of shoe prints beginning near the fence line and ending inches from the guest house threshold before turning back toward the main house. They were not rushed or uneven. Whoever made them had approached carefully, then stood still for a moment. From where I was standing, I could also see through the main house window that the porch light switch was positioned exactly where someone inside could control visibility of the driveway without stepping out. The morning sun flattened everything, making the pale gravel look almost clinical. I finished my inspections and checked out a day early without mentioning the footprints. Nothing overtly threatening had happened, and the stay, technically, had delivered everything the listing promised. Even now, what unsettles me is not the possibility of being watched, but the quiet routine of it, as if someone had done it before. The last thing I saw in the rearview mirror was the guest house door marked Unit B, and above the gravel, the porch light switching off again in full daylight. If this account stayed with you, share it with someone who appreciates grounded horror. Subscribe for the next one. Late February, I was 43 and working as a structural safety consultant, traveling through several coastal towns in Maine to inspect aging municipal buildings before renovation budgets were finalized. Winter travel in those areas limits hotel options, especially during the off-season, so I rented a small Airbnb apartment above a closed antique shop along the harbor road. The listing described it as a quiet winter retreat. According to the host, the shop downstairs stayed closed until spring. My routine was predictable: daytime inspections, then quiet evenings documenting structural reports. Wind pushed salty harbor air against the old window frames while I worked. Beneath the building hung a weathered sign reading Harbor Antiques, EST 1972. If you subscribe, you'll hear more accounts like this shared as plainly as they happened. The host explained through Airbnb messages that the antique shop belonged to his parents and remained shut all winter. Entry to the apartment was through a narrow stairwell beside the storefront. Inside, the space felt older but well-maintained: polished wood floors, heavy dark furniture, thick curtains that muted the harbor lights at night. It had the quiet solidity of a building that had been standing for generations. I kept my focus on work. My days were spent inside municipal buildings measuring load points and documenting cracks, and my evenings were reserved for organizing those notes. The brass key left for me was labeled upstairs guest, and the stairwell door below it locked with a small interior deadbolt. The first night passed quietly until late evening. Around 10:57 p.m., while reviewing inspection photos at the small dining table, I heard a faint movement from the shop floor below. It sounded like something wooden sliding slightly across a floor, slow, deliberate friction rather than a sudden drop. I paused and listened. The noise lasted only a few seconds before stopping completely. My first assumption was simple enough. Perhaps someone from the family had stopped by the shop briefly to retrieve inventory. The building settled again into silence, and nothing else happened that night. Over the next 2 evenings, the sounds returned. Each time they occurred well after midnight, always brief, always coming from somewhere directly beneath the apartment floorboards. It was never loud enough to identify clearly, just a careful shifting of weight, a scrape of wood against wood. When I stepped outside to check the street, the harbor road remained empty, and the antique shop windows stayed completely dark. By the third night, I noticed something else while standing near the interior stairwell door. A narrow strip of light appeared briefly beneath the door leading down into the shop, thin and pale against the floor. When I leaned closer, the stairwell carried a hollow echo, as though footsteps somewhere below had just stopped. At that point, the explanation given by the host began to feel less certain. The shop was supposed to remain closed through winter, yet the sound suggested someone moving objects below at irregular hours. I considered messaging the host to ask whether family members were accessing storage downstairs, but I hesitated. In small towns, buildings often serve several practical uses during the off-season. It felt unnecessary to raise concerns over something that might simply be routine. Still, when I stood near the stairwell door, I could smell faint dust drifting through the seam beneath it, and through a narrow crack, I could see the weak glow of a single bare bulb somewhere below. If you enjoy slow-burn, realistic horror, you can leave a like. On the 4th night, the sounds began earlier and lasted longer. Instead of a brief scrape, there was slow, methodical movement across the floor beneath me, as though someone were opening and shifting furniture piece by piece. Curiosity eventually overruled caution. I unlocked the stairwell door quietly and stepped halfway down the narrow wooden staircase. From there I could see into the antique shop floor. The room was mostly dark, but a portable work light near the back cast a dull beam across the dust. Several antique cabinets stood open, their doors hanging slightly ajar as though someone had been searching through them. I stayed still on the step, trying to determine if anyone else was present. Then, somewhere deeper in the shop, a door opened. A moment later came footsteps, slow, measured steps moving toward the front of the room. Instinctively, I stepped back up the stairs and closed the door as gently as I could. On the other side, the footsteps reached the base of the stairwell and stopped. I slid the deadbolt back into place and quietly positioned a chair against the stairwell door. For several minutes I stood in the apartment kitchen listening, but no sound followed. Eventually a distant door closed somewhere below, and the building returned to complete stillness. The following morning I woke to a routine message from the host reminding me about checkout procedures later that week. There was no mention of anyone entering the shop overnight. The house felt ordinary again, sunlight pushing weakly through the curtains and the harbor wind rattling the old window frames. Before leaving for inspections that morning, I walked around the block and glanced through the antique shop windows from outside. The cabinets I had seen open were now neatly closed. No work light remained visible inside. What unsettled me most appeared behind the building in the narrow alley. Overnight snow had settled lightly across the ground, thin enough to show every disturbance clearly. Yet there were no footprints leading to or from the shop's rear service door. Wind pushed loose snow slowly across the alley, smoothing the surface as though nothing had crossed it. The stay ended without any confrontation or explanation. The host never mentioned anyone entering the building overnight, and I never raised the question directly. Even now I cannot explain who had been moving through that shop beneath me, or how they might have entered or left without disturbing the snow outside. What stays with me is the moment those footsteps stopped directly beneath the stairwell, as though someone had sensed movement above them. The last image I remember clearly is the stairwell door at the top of the steps, labeled simply private. If this account stayed with you, share it with someone who appreciates grounded horror. Mid-May, I was 45 and traveling through rural Ohio conducting environmental compliance inspections for several small manufacturing sites scattered between farming towns. The work required early mornings, usually starting before sunrise, so I booked a simple Airbnb basement suite outside one of the towns where 2 inspections were scheduled. The listing described a quiet country home with a private exterior entrance to the basement apartment. The house itself sat alone at the end of a long gravel driveway surrounded by open fields. At night there was almost no traffic, only wind moving slowly through the farmland. Warm spring air drifted through the basement window wells while I unpacked my notes. If you subscribe, you'll hear more accounts like this told as plainly as they happened. I expected to stay 3 nights while finishing inspections within about 40 miles of the property. The host greeted me briefly when I arrived that afternoon. She mentioned she worked overnight hospital shifts and would be leaving around dusk most evenings. After she drove away, the property became extremely quiet in a way that felt particular to rural areas. No nearby houses, no passing cars, just open land and distant insects. The basement apartment itself was clean but sparse. A small table, a couch, a bed along one wall, and a short hallway leading deeper into the foundation. The exterior door used a coded lockbox key, and the only constant background sound was the occasional vibration of a sump pump activating beneath the floor. Almost immediately I noticed something slightly unusual about the hallway layout. At the far end, about 6 feet from the kitchen area, was a door that remained locked from the other side. The host had described the basement apartment as completely private, yet this door clearly connected to another part of the house's foundation. When the sump pump activated, the vibration sometimes caused the latch to rattle softly. The knob would twitch slightly, just enough to catch my attention while I worked. It was subtle, easy to dismiss as mechanical movement, but the sound carried clearly through the otherwise quiet room. Each evening I returned from inspections around dusk and spent a couple hours organizing field notes at the small kitchen table. Around the same time every night, close to 11 p.m., I began hearing faint sounds from the other side of that locked hallway door. At first they resembled ordinary plumbing shifts or the movement of pipes adjusting to temperature changes. But over time the pattern changed. The sounds came in quiet intervals, a shift of weight, a few careful steps, then stillness again. It was the kind of movement that suggested someone moving slowly rather than mechanical noise. According to the host, she was working night shifts during those hours. If you enjoy slow burn, realistic horror, you can leave a like. By the second evening, I found myself listening more closely than working. That night, I placed my small gray carry-on suitcase in the hallway, partly blocking the door. I told myself it was simply convenient storage space near the entrance. In truth, I wanted a reference point, something that would show whether the door ever opened from the other side. When I woke early the next morning to prepare for inspections, the suitcase had shifted several inches toward the wall. The change was small but noticeable. I stood there for a moment trying to recall whether I had moved it while passing through the hallway the night before. It was possible, yet I remembered leaving it centered against the door. The third night, the sounds began earlier. I had just finished organizing inspection reports when the hallway went quiet in a way that made the room feel suddenly attentive. Then I heard the door handle turn. Slowly, the brushed steel knob rotated from the other side, as though someone were testing it with care. The latch clicked softly, but the door didn't open because the suitcase remained pressed against it. I stayed seated at the kitchen table, watching the hallway from across the room. After several seconds, the handle turned again, slightly farther this time, as if someone was checking whether the door might give if they tried more firmly. The latch released again with a dull metallic click before settling back into place. Eventually, the handle stopped moving. A moment later, I heard quiet footsteps retreating deeper into the house structure, fading gradually through the concrete walls. The hallway remained still after that. The following morning, the host returned from her overnight shift. She appeared tired but otherwise normal, carrying a small bag from her car toward the main house entrance upstairs. I mentioned casually that I had noticed a locked door in the basement hallway and wondered whether anyone else accessed that area. She explained it led to an unused storage space and said no one used it anymore. Her answer sounded genuine, but it didn't fully account for what I had heard the night before. Morning sunlight filtered faintly through the basement window wells as I finished packing my equipment. I decided to complete the day's inspections and check out later that afternoon rather than stay another night. While loading my car into the trunk, I walked around the side of the house to stretch my legs. That was when I noticed a second basement window partly hidden by tall grass along the foundation. The metal screen was bent outward slightly, as though it had been pushed from inside or pulled from outside at some point. When I crouched to look closer, I realized the window aligned almost perfectly with the interior hallway where the locked door stood. The window well beside it was about 3 feet deep, large enough for someone to climb in if they were careful. Wind moved slowly through the grass, brushing against the bent screen. I never reported the incident through Airbnb. Nothing concrete had happened, and there was no clear proof of anyone entering the basement. The host may genuinely have been unaware that the hallway could be reached from outside the house. Still, what stays with me is the sound of that door handle turning slowly in the quiet basement late at night. Not forcing its way open, not knocking, just testing the barrier between us. When I picture that hallway now, I still see the gray suitcase resting against the door, rolled 3 inches closer to the wall than I remembered leaving it. If this account stayed with you, share it with someone who appreciates grounded horror. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one.